Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about the idea of how could you rebuild after a disaster. If you're dealing with something like a hurricane or even a more long-term disaster situation, there's a very good chance that sooner or later you're going to need to do something like make repairs to your home, mend a fence, build fortifications, or some other structure. Being able to retain the ability to use power tools in that situation could potentially be a game changer. Of course, it's going to allow you to work faster, but more important than that, it's going to allow you to save your energy. If you're especially in a long-term situation, there's a very good chance that food is going to be scarce. And doing something like hard manual labor, working yourself to death on an empty stomach, that could be extremely dangerous, especially if you couple that with things like extreme heat. So being able to use power tools, that's going to take some of that off of you, make your job easier, make your life easier, save some calories so that you can save your energy for other things that you may need to do in that situation. But of course, the big problem with power tools is how in the world are you going to keep them running, especially during a long-term situation, because there's a lot of gas generators out there that can run pretty much anything that you might want to run tool-wise. But they're only going to be as good as the amount of fuel that you have stored for them. Once you run out of fuel, it's game over. The generator's not going to work, and then the tools, they're going to be the next domino to fall. But we now live in a day and age where there are some solar power options out there that are fully capable of running almost any power tool that you may want them to run. And then, of course, also be able to keep up with the other things that you would want an emergency power source to be able to do. They're going to be able to run things like fans, lights, charge batteries, maybe even keep your box freezer running. So today we're going to be taking a look at the Ecoflow Delta Max, go over its specs real quick, but also, more importantly, take a look at a real-world example of what this power station specifically is capable of in regards to keeping power tools up and running, and that includes some larger ones. I did a building project that used things like miter saws and table saws, and we're going to see how this did with that. Was it able to get them started? Was it able to power them long enough to complete that project? Before we go any further, I'd like to thank Ecoflow for sending us their Delta Max and some panels to take a look at, and for sponsoring this video. Now, Prime Day starts tomorrow, and it's one of the best times of the year to get a great deal on the Delta Max and other Ecoflow products, things like the original Delta, then also their River series. So be sure to check in the link below in the description so that you guys can check out those deals if you're interested. And if you come across this maybe a little bit later, maybe after Prime Day's over, it doesn't hurt to go ahead and check out the link anyway, because Ecoflow does run different promotions different times of the year. So getting into some real world uses, the Delta Max is going to have no problems running your box freezer or refrigerator. And it's also going to be able to power your washing machine if the power goes out right in the middle of a load. You're going to be able to finish that up, no problem at all. You're going to be able to do other things like keep lights on in your house, like lamps, also keep fans running, as well as charge batteries for various devices. But the thing is I have shown solar generators running devices like that in some other videos that I've done. This is not my first solar generator review, and I figured I could only show it running a box freezer one more time before everybody's just like, ugh. So I wanted to go a little bit of a different route with this. I wanted to show what this could do in a situation where you needed to either build something or make repairs, and to do that, you would need to run some larger power tools. I wanted to see if this would be able to run the tools and finish the project. And I was wanting some container garden stands to put my buckets in so it would look a little bit nicer in my yard, make weed eating a little bit easier. So I thought using this would be the perfect way to build those. And even though I'm not actually building a house or making repairs or something like that, a lot of the things that I needed to do and a lot of the tools that I needed to use to build that container garden stand are going to be the same processes and the same tools that you would need if you actually were making repairs. You're going to be doing things like making crosscuts in dimensional lumber for making things like studs. You're going to be doing rip cuts in plywood and dimensional lumber to square up edges or to make plywood sheets that you can cover windows with. And then also, you might even need to use a circular saw to cut some sheet metal for some roofing material. And I wanted this to be as realistic as possible, so I decided to do it at a completely off-grid location. My dad and I drove nearly an hour and a half to our hunting property, and it has no electrical hookups anywhere on it, and the only power source that we used for it was the Delta Max. I brought my dad with me to have an extra set of hands, and just in case there was an accident since he has a medical background. Texas heat, a remote location, and power tools are not good things to combine together when you're by yourself. The tools that we used were a circular saw, sliding miter saw, and a table saw. These were powered totally by the Delta Max throughout the duration of the project. The only tools that didn't run straight off the Delta Max were my drill and impact driver. I don't have good corded versions of those tools, and they don't use nearly as much power as the other tools do anyway. I started by measuring the 2x4s I'd be using as the frame of the container garden stand. I designed it so that one cut on each board would give me the pieces I needed without having to make an extra cut. Then I moved over to the miter saw and made my cuts. The miter saw has a 10-inch blade and uses just over 2,000 watts on startup, and then it settles into around 900 to 1,000 watts for the rest of the cut. I did this 4 times to get all the pieces I needed to assemble the top and bottom frames. After that, I measured my boards for the vertical supports. These will attach to the corners of the frame and will give the container stand its height and help hide the ends of the corrugated steel we'll install at the end. From there, I made my cuts. Since I used 1x6s for this, I had to use the sliding feature on my miter saw. To do this, start at the side closest to you, cut into the wood, and then push away towards the main body of the saw. Using a miter saw is a good test of the Delta Max's inverter since you're subjecting it to higher starting watts each time you make a cut, and the Delta Max didn't have any problems with it. A miter saw works well for making precision cuts in dimensional lumber and would be useful for making repairs in a disaster. After that, I needed to square the edges of the 1x6s that I had just cut. They originally had rounded edges that would have made assembling the container stand difficult and not look as good. To get rid of these edges, I used a table saw to knock 1/8 of an inch off of each side. The table saw used around 2,000 watts on startup and then settled into around 700 watts as the saw was running, and the wattage increased to around 800 as wood was being pushed through the saw. In an emergency, you could use a table saw to cut plywood sheets to cover windows or patch holes, as well as make cross cuts and rip cuts in dimensional lumber. And when I was done making my cuts, I began the process of assembling the pieces. I drilled pilot holes into the 2x4s and then used deck screws to assemble my frame. Drills and impact drivers are essential around the house and for making emergency repairs. Solar generators like the Delta Max will allow you to keep your batteries charged almost indefinitely when paired with a good set of solar panels. After I assembled the frame, I began attaching the vertical supports to the top and bottom pieces. These meet up at a 90-degree angle with each other at each corner of the container stand. Once the structure of the container stand was complete, it was time to cut the corrugated metal that would form the inside walls. I started by measuring where we needed to cut and marking it with a chalk line, which actually did adhere to the metal well enough to see it while making the cut. I then made a cut down the length of the metal using a circular saw, which is probably the most power-hungry tool that we used that day. It required a little over 3,400 watts on startup and stayed around 1,100 or 1,200 watts through most of the cut. A circular saw is one of the most important tools when making repairs or building structures. If you know what you're doing, it can do many of the same tasks as a table saw or miter saw and can be taken anywhere that has some sort of power source. Like with the other tools, the Delta Max had no problem keeping it running. We then measured the metal we had cut similar to how we measured the 2x4 at the beginning. Making a couple of more cuts gave us both our long and short pieces that will serve as the walls of the container stand. After cutting the metal, we attached it to the 2x4s using self-tapping screws and an impact driver. And once all the sheet metal was attached, the container garden stand was complete. I was pretty confident that the Delta Max would be able to run the tools and get the job done, but I wasn't sure how much battery power it would have left. I was surprised to see that it still had 89% remaining. using a miter saw, table saw, and an older circular saw only used 11% of its capacity. And if y'all remember the video I did a couple weeks ago where it was power tools preppers need, you remember this scene with the angle grinder. What you can't see in that shot is the Delta Max is what is powering that angle grinder. So getting into the specs of the Delta Max, this is the Delta Max 2000. It has a capacity of 2016 watt hours, which is basically 2 kilowatt hours. But you do have the ability to expand your capacity up to 6 kilowatt hours by adding some Delta Max smart batteries, which you can purchase separately. So between this and then being able to add 2 of those batteries, that will expand it to that 6 kilowatt hours. It can handle up to 2,400 running watts and 5,000 surge watts, which is going to be able to power pretty much any single device in your home that uses 110 volt AC. It's not going to be able to do 220 because it doesn't have the plugs for that. But pretty much anything in your house that plugs into a normal wall outlet, this is going to be able to keep it running. And it does have Ecoflow's X-Boost feature, which will allow it to run devices that require up to 3,400 running watts, which basically what X-Boost is. It's kind of like a governor that says, hey, I see that you're trying to use more power than what I can provide to you. So I'm just going to give you this much. I'm not going to overload myself. And if you want to shut down, that's okay. So that's good for things like maybe like a heat gun. I don't know of a heat gun that would use 3,400 watts. I guess there's some. Mine uses like a little over 1,000. But devices like that that may require a little bit more than 2,400 running watts, it's just basically going to give that device a ceiling. And the Delta Max can also connect to the Ecoflow app, which allows you to do things like turn on and off the various outputs on the device. And you can use this device without the app. So if you're somebody who has no interest in using the app, then this will run perfectly fine without it. I've used this thing a bunch and I've never connected it to the app. But if you want to have a little bit more control over the device and be able to control it from your phone, you do have that option. The Delta Max can also recharge very quickly. That is a feature that's common to all Ecoflow power stations, and they have that extreme charging technology which makes that possible. But this can go from 0 to 80% from an AC power plug in 65 minutes. So that's useful if there's a storm coming your way, you need to top it off, or you've already used its capacity and you want to hook it up to a gas generator to charge it back up. It's going to be able to do that quickly, use less of your fuel. But you can also combine AC charging, which is 1,800 watts maximum, with either Ecoflow's smart generator or solar panels to get even more wattage in the device at once, which will allow it to charge faster. And of course, you can also hook this up to solar panels. It can handle 800 maximum watts of input from solar panels. You can hook it up to the 12 volt port in your car to recharge that way. And it includes all the cables that you would need to plug it into the wall, hook it up to solar panels, and power it from your vehicle. The Delta Max also has plenty of output plugs. It has 6 AC outlets that can provide that 2,400 watts total output, 4 USB-A ports, 2 of those are fast charge ports, 2 USB-C ports for powering things like iPhones and laptops, 2 DC 5521 ports for powering things like routers. Then it also comes with a car power output for 12 volt devices. The Delta Max weighs 48 pounds, which is a little bit on the heavier side, but it's still lighter than a lot of gas generators. And if you choose to get 160 watt panels with the Delta Max, those weigh 15.4 pounds. The Delta Max has a warranty of 24 months and can go 800 charging cycles while still retaining 80% of its original capacity. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope this was beneficial for y'all and kind of let y'all see something new that maybe you haven't seen some sort of solar generator or solar power station do before. If you want to see more videos about what solar generators can do and how to deal with grid down scenarios, y'all can click on these cards. Y'all have a good one. Thanks again.